My name is Lena Bergström. I am from SLU Aqua in Sweden and a member of SciComm. So on behalf of the ICES Science Committee, I'm excited to make the introduction for our last keynote speaker of this conference. Our keynote speaker is Ute Daewel from the Helmholtz-Zentrum Hereon in Germany, where she leads the Department for Matter Transport and Ecosystem Dynamics. Ute's scientific expertise centers around the biological physical interactions in marine ecosystems and the development and utilization of coupled model systems. The coupled model systems are useful tools to help us understand both natural variability and the impacts of human activities on marine ecosystems, from biogeochemistry to hydrotrophic levels. We are in the midst of an urgent need for efforts to enhance renewable energy and mitigate global warming, but also with increasing questions about this means for the marine environment. In relation to this, Ute's work on the large-scale effects of offshore wind farms has helped us understand more about what region-wide changes on productivity could be foreseen under extensive offshore wind development, such as in the North Seas. To many of us, Ute Daewel is also known as a member of and co-chair of the ICES Group of Integrative Physical, Biological, and Ecosystem Modeling. But for all of us now, please help us welcome Ute to present.
That was part of the performance, obviously. Thanks, Lena, so much. And thanks to everyone to be here. I'm glad and excited and honored, of course, to give that keynote lecture. First things first, I'd like to prepare for everyone to prepare your phone, because I hope you will need it in a couple of minutes. Mic is not on?
It's on.
It's on? It's on? It's on? Because, then I have to speak here. That will be very uncomfortable. Give me. Okay. Is that better? Yeah. Well, so I'd like to prepare your phones, because you will need it in a couple of minutes. I hope at least that worked out. And now you dive right in. So why am I even standing here? This is nothing new, but I want to set the context. 2024 has been officially declared the warmest year since records in 1850. And climate change is not new, and it's threatening, or it's one of the major threats for us and for our environments, and for, of course, also for the marine ecosystems. And there, we discussed about changes in stratification, changes in species communities, larger threats from marine extremes. So we need to do something, and if we don't come up with a really good idea how to reduce our energy demands on the next, let's say, couple of months, we need to find something else. So, okay, we tested everything, and now the text is missing. Well, let's see what's going on. Anyways, one of the major ideas here is, of course, renewable energy. And installing offshore energy in offshore areas is, of course, a very good idea, because we have good wind situations without any obstacles or friction. And there are a number of areas where there are plans for wind installation in the coming years. And here you can very nicely see where the hotspots are. Obviously, China, they're installing wind farms very quickly, and then there is a major hotspot in Europe. And you have seen the numbers a couple of times. They were originally on top of this. So the EU pledged to install more than 300 gigawatts in the Nordic seas by 2050. So that is a lot, and you can see the North Sea is in the hotspot of this. So in the following, I will mainly talk about the North Sea. The North Sea will be really covered with offshore wind farms. And we see here on the left side situation in 2023, 30 gigawatts wind farms in the size of small villages. And then by 2050, we have wind farms in the size of larger cities. So obviously, every time we install something in our environment, we can expect that this impacts the area, and in case of offshore wind farms, it will be impacting the atmosphere, the ocean, and the marine ecosystem. Okay, so now you hopefully need your phones, because before I go into the topic, I want to see what your opinions are. And this questionnaire has actually 2 questions. So the first, it's nuts. We were so good in testing, and now we're going crazy. So yeah, scan the QR code. So the first question is, do you think marine wind farms are a threat or an opportunity? And the second question is, what component of the marine ecosystems do you think are most threatened by offshore wind farms? It doesn't work. I'm sorry. And normally it should do something, but it doesn't. Obviously. Can you see it? Yeah, okay, obviously it doesn't work. So I'm assuming that everyone is currently entering the answers. And for whatever reason it worked before, it doesn't work now, so you can't see the answers online, and I can't see them either.
Try this.
Okay, this is very crazy. Because of course I have no idea how to respond now. Let's do something else. I apologize for this. Let's do some action. For those people who think the offshore wind farms are a threat, could you maybe raise your hand? A threat? A threat, something dangerous.
No, that's not a threat. You're trying to have a threat of wall, basically, here. At least one line. Okay, well, it's
something dangerous. Offshore wind farms are something dangerous. Does anyone think something offshore wind farms are? Okay, there are a couple of people who think that. So, does Yes think that's an opportunity? Okay, I love that. Lovely. Second question, let's do that very quickly. So who thinks birds and mammals are most impacted? Yeah, okay, that's a good deal. Who thinks fish is most impacted? Oh, that's not so many. Benthic fauna? Yeah, of course, there was a whole session on macrofauna activity. And plankton. Okay, interesting. Okay, let's see if we can shed some light on what offshore wind farms actually do. So offshore wind farms impact the ecosystem during all stages of their installation. So during planning, we know there is sonar. During installation, I think the largest threat is probably noise, although there are already quite nice mitigation strategies for that. During decommissioning, there is research coming up now, so that's an open question, I would say. And then I will talk about operation and maintenance. And there are a couple of things that would possibly impact the ecosystem during that phase. One thing would be, of course, the wind extraction, turbulence in the ocean, but also artificial reef. As I said, there was a whole long session on this, very interesting. We have changes in fisheries, we have cables, we have changes in shipping. So those things I will be talking about are changes in the physical ocean, dynamics through atmospheric wakes and ocean wakes. I will talk a bit about artificial reefs as well, because I think that will interact. And I will also talk a bit about fishing. So let's start with low trophic ecosystem dynamics, because plankton is really important in the ocean. And to get you an idea, or to kind of set the context for this, I will give you a very brief introduction into the North Sea ecosystem. Probably most of you are very well aware of this, but it doesn't hurt to kind of get a little introduction here. So the North Sea is strongly structured actually by the shallow bathymetry and by strong tidal currents. And that makes the system very special. So if we make a little cut through orthogonal orthogonal to our coast, and we get something like this. So we have an area which is very strongly mixed due to the strong tidal currents and the shallow bathymetry. And in this area we have high production, but normally we also have, and this is shown by this figure here up here, normally light limitation. Then we have this frontal zone that separates the permanently mixed area from the seasonally stratified system. And these are very productive systems where nutrients still reach the euphoric zone, often throughout the year. And then we have the seasonally stratified region, and that's rather special. So early in the year, the system starts to stratify, we have primary production, but then over the course of the year, we get actually nutrient limitation in the surface area, and then we get also uptake of oxygen in the deeper areas. So there is a vertical gradient of nutrients and oxygen. And this is very important. That creates a very specific region, very specific dynamic. Oh, the movie works, I'm glad. This creates a very specific dynamics in the North Sea, and this is shown. This shows a dynamic of primary production from a model simulation. And what you can see in winter, nothing, or not much, and then in spring, this primary production starts, goes through the North Sea, and then during the year, it creates these very special features with high productivity in the frontal areas. You saw it also on Dogger Bank. And in this system, we set now our offshore wind farms, and we also will see that most of the offshore wind farms are actually set in these high productive areas of the fronts. What happens if we put these wind farms in our environment? That can be nicely seen from satellite pictures, for example. So if we zoom in this kind of satellite picture, we see nicely these offshore wind parks, and we can also see what's actually happened in the atmosphere. So there you can see these atmospheric breaks, so they are more turbulent, and of course energy is extracted from the atmosphere, so they are also less energetic, so wind is reduced. We also see these tidal currents, so this is the current direction, and there we have a stronger mixing in the system. So we have these two processes that act on the physical environment: energy extraction and flow resistance for foundations. And we also have, these two act on very different scales. So these energy extraction by turbines, these atmospheric breaks, they can reach to up to 65 kilometers in lee of the offshore wind farm under stable atmospheric conditions, while this flow-resistant induced turbulence normally acts on 1 to 2 kilometers. So what happens in our ocean if we do that? Or let's look at first, that one's working as well, I love it, on how that looks in the atmosphere. So this is from a high-resolution regional climate simulation where wind farms were actually implemented into the model. And you can nicely see in lee of these wind farms, that is in gray are these wind farms, so in lee of these wind farms, under the specific wind conditions, you can see this reduction in wind speed, and this is indicated by these bubbles, while the colors on the ocean actually indicate changes in the heat flux. So there is a systematic change in the heat flux with the ocean, and of course the wind also changes, or changes in the wind speed also changes the wind-induced currents in the ocean. So let's have a look at what actually happens at the ocean. Again, we have on the left side the change in wind speed. This is parameterized. This is from a simulation from Niels Christiansen that was nicely published here. I think many of you know that publication. And on the right side, you can see the response of the surface ocean current to this reduction in wind speed. And I think that's a very nice simulation or representation, because in some of the areas you can nicely see how the wind speed actually reduces the surface current, and this is what we would expect, right? You also see, if you're very attentive, that there are some areas where sometimes the response is actually positive. That might be a bit counterintuitive, but it's actually quite logical, because these are areas with strong tides in certain directions. So if the tidal current goes in the opposite direction to the wind, the reduction in wind speed would actually enhance the current speed. It would be nice if that were all, but of course the ocean is a 3D water body, so we have to think a bit wider. What happens when wind stress reaches the ocean surface? So they take along the currents, and actually the transport of the ocean water is to the right of the wind speed, so the so-called Ekman transport. Also here I probably assume that most of you know what the Ekman transport is. So if you think about a wind farm here and then the wind is reduced in lee of the wind farm, actually an Ekman transport would also be reduced. And that leads to convergences to the right side of the wind farm and to divergences to the left side of the wind farm. So if you have convergences and divergences in the ocean, that leads to upwelling and downwelling systems. So this is also something that we need to consider. And I just, so you can imagine that a bit, I put here results from a model simulation. So these black polygons are the assumed wind farms. The wind in these situations come from the southwest. And you can very nicely see how the ocean adapts. So this is a vertical velocity at 20-meter depths. So to the right, we have upwelling, and to the left, we have downwelling. So the model actually confirms this dynamics. So what we were actually interested in, so when we build these large-scale installations for offshore wind into our North Sea, what happens to our ecosystem? And for this, we use this model chain, and you will see this figure a couple of times in the following. We have an atmospheric model where wind farms are parameterized. So these simulations will be used to force a physical ocean model, in this case Hamsam, and this is fully coupled with an ecosystem model that covers major functional groups for phytoplankton, zooplankton, and nutrient cycles in the ocean. So first we looked at what happened to the physical situation when we install 120 gigawatt in the southern North Sea, and here this indicates actually the wind reduction, so about 10% wind reduction in the vicinity of these wind parks. And what we see if we do an annual average of the change of the residual currents, that actually the ocean responds systematically with a reduction in residual currents in the deeper waters and on a regional-wide scale, not only inside the offshore wind farms. And I think this is a very important outcome. What happens in the wind farms is not necessarily the major response of a wind farm to the system. What else did we see? Well, there's a major change in stratification, and especially in the seasonal stratified area. So this black line was meant to indicate the differentiation between the mixed and frontal areas from the seasonal stratified area. So we have this big wind farm here in the seasonally stratified region. And here we can see that this implication of the offshore wind farms actually is strengthening of the stratification in shallow and mixed air depths. And we see something similar in the vicinity of the Dogger Bank. So what does that mean for our ecosystem now? Finally. This is average annual primary production from the model simulation as the reference. And this is the changes, the relative changes of primary production in the system as the model simulates. First of all, if you average this whole thing, you will find out that there is no net change. So there is no, for the whole system, there is no general increase or decrease of primary production. But you can also see that there is inside the offshore wind farms, for example, seems to be a decrease in primary production, and in the vicinity, like in the shallower areas, and also here over oyster ground, there seems to be an increase of about 10%. And so it seems there is, or the model indicates there is a systematic restructuring of the productivity patterns, both in the horizontal but also in the vertical dimension. So this is changes in primary production inside the offshore wind farms, in blue in regions which are well mixed, and then in green in regions which are seasonally stratified. And obviously in summer, the strengthening of the stratification leads to a repositioning of the subsurface chlorophyll maximum in a somewhat higher, or closer to the surface. How does that affect the food webs? This is just for completing this information. So this is phytoplankton biomass, which is not always completely aligned with primary production because we have top-down and bottom-up effect. But you see a rather similar structure to the primary production. And then this is the response of zooplankton. It generally also follows this bottom-up effect, and we have more zooplankton in the shallower areas. But there's also, for example, the hotspots that indicate that there are also top-down responses, and this relates probably to other ecosystem variables. So let me quickly also talk about other ecosystem variables, because I think this is important also if you kind of compare it to the impact of artificial reefs, for example. So the reduction in residual currents would also lead to a reduction in bottom shear stress. And that actually, in the model, and I hope also, probably also in reality, leads to a restructuring of the sediment, biogenic sediment in the area. So we have less sediments in the shallower areas, and there is accumulation of sediment further offshore. What was also interesting, we looked at the bottom water oxygen, and normally the North Sea is not necessarily endangered with hypoxic or anoxic situations. But there are some areas where we know, or where observations show that they become hypoxic during late summer and autumn. And one of these areas is actually oyster grounds. And so the model indicates that in this area, where normally a lot of material accumulates and then remineralized, oxygen would even decrease more. So that could actually be really a threat to the system. So let me shortly summarize these effects. The atmospheric wake leads to stronger stratification, less mixing, reduced current velocities, and these upwelling and downwelling dipoles. We have a restructuring of the marine ecosystem with changes to up to 10%, but the average change for the area was lower than 1%. We see redistribution of organic carbon sediments and also a reduction in bottom water oxygen in some endangered areas. The second process I want to talk about is this flow resistance through foundation, which typically leads to this kind of enhanced turbulence in lee of the structures. As I said before, this is, depending on your current speed, can reach a couple of kilometers, but it's typically in the range of 1 to 2 kilometers. There are a number of studies who at least looked at how this affects, for example, turbidity. Very nice study by Robert Foster. And then there's this hypothetical paper from Robert Daewel, who was interested in how that would possibly affect the primary production. Now, there is no hard evidence on the impact on primary production, as far as I know. If somebody knows more, please let me know. So the hypothesis is this increase in turbulence would increase nutrient availability in the euphotic zone, and by that, increasing primary production in that area. There's a bit of modeling research on this topic. This is a very nice figure from my colleague Jeff Carpenter from an LES simulation on structures on this mixing in the tidal stream in the North Sea. And I like that very much because it shows how this turbulence actually develops in lee of the structure. The problem is I would love to do LES modeling on the whole North Sea and see how that affects my ecosystem, but of course it's super expensive because it's very high resolved. So here we found a parameterization for that process in our regional model. And again, this is a study by Niels Christiansen, where he implemented this parameterization in a regional ocean model to see how that on average affect the physical system dynamic. So we have changes in current speed on this side and horizontal and also in the vertical, changes in vertical eddy diffusivity, so a measure for mixing in the middle, and then we have the vertical temperature differential, so the difference between bottom water and surface temperature on the right side. And you can nicely see, again, current speeds are reduced here, but inside the offshore wind farm, mixing is enhanced. That's what we was expecting, of course. And this results, for example, to a change in temperature difference. So there's got to be a less colder water mixed up into the surface and warmer water mixed down to the deeper regions. There are also observations on this. So Jens Flöter tried to trace this effect in reality and was, let's say, partly successful. So what you see here is observations on temperature, and there is an offshore wind farm here. And this is observations on potential density anomaly, or at least they estimated afterwards from the observation. And you can nicely see inside these offshore wind farms, there's this dome shape that indicates that there's a temperature change here and also change in stratification inside the offshore wind farm. They also looked at chlorophyll, and that was to my understanding, not so conclusive. So these are a couple of different profiles with offshore wind farms, and you can see that there is no generalized response. So there is not generally an increase in chlorophyll. But also it's very difficult to track that in reality because, of course, chlorophyll, once it's produced, it enters the food web, it gets advected. So it could basically be produced there and end up everywhere. So let me briefly summarize this. So we have stronger mixing in the of this wind, or in the current direction of the structures, which destratifies the situation, but also reduce current velocity. We have upward mixing of suspended matter and probably also nutrients that might lead to increased primary production. So if you want to piece these information together, this figure is from a nice report that just currently came out by Mariam Ma from Aarhus University. We have actually a response from the atmospheric wakes that increased stratification, less mixing, and then we have a response from the mixing, from the structure-induced mixing that actually works in the opposite direction. But of course, both act also on different scales, right? We have here like about 100 kilometers, and this is very near field or inside the wind farms. So there are two simulations out on these effects. So this is, again, a study from my colleague Niels Christiansen. You see he does a lot of these simulations. Where he tried to piece that together as well. So again, we have here surface velocities on the upper panels, and then we have turbulent kinetic energy on the lower panel. Again, this measure for mixing. And then this is a simulation on the left side is a simulation with only the atmospheric wake, in the middle is with mixing, and on the right side is a simulation where it's combined. And you can very nicely see that a stronger effect comes from the atmospheric wakes unless you are inside the offshore wind farm. And when we zoom in a bit, we can nicely see that in these near coastal areas where the wind farms are really densely built, these are older wind farms with smaller piles. If you go a bit further offshore, actually, the strengthening of the stratification and the turbulence are somewhat averaged out, while in the surrounding you have a decrease in mixing. So let me talk a bit about this report that Mari has published just recently, because I think that will teach us a lot. So this is a scenario she ran with different offshore wind farms installed in the North Sea. And then she actually looked at similar parameters than we did before. Potential energy anomaly as a measure for stratification, primary production and zooplankton. Shown here are not averages, but medians. So she estimated the difference for each day between April and October, and then she estimated the median of this. So it's the most likely situation of response. And you can see it looks very much like the simulations before, although, of course, without the wind farms here, for example, in these seasonal stratified areas. So we have increase in potential energy anomaly. So there is a dominance of the offshore wind wakes. We have increase in primary production here somewhat near coast, and then there is apparently also restructuring of the primary production, and we have a similar response to the zooplankton. What was even more interesting was actually this analysis. And this is not easy to catch with the eye, so I need a few seconds to get through it, and I will help you to also get through it. So what you see here is stratification versus wind speed change, and then the color is the current speed of the ocean, so basically the tidal current speed. And if you look very closely, you find that there is an increase in stratification with decreasing wind speed change. So the stronger the wind speed change, the stronger the stratification. For situations with relatively low current speeds. Situations with intermediate current speed, we see there's an opposite response, so there seem to be stronger mixing or less stratification. And then for very strong current speeds, actually the response is almost not there. So now primary production versus wind speed change. It's the same thing. So we have, for low current speed, we see that there is a reduction in primary production generally, but it doesn't really scale with a reduction in wind speed. For intermediate current speed, we have higher primary productions. So it seems that if you have more current speed, you have more mixing on the structures. So all these results are inside offshore wind farms. They are not on a large scale. And then if we have a lot of current speed, it's so well mixed that the wind farm would not make a difference. And the last picture actually summarizes it. So there is a less primary production with increasing stratification, more primary production with reduced stratification, and then high current speeds don't show really a big response. And I think this is very important because that kind of forms the basis. I will now very briefly talk about artificial reefs because I think you have heard, hopefully you have heard a lot about artificial reefs just during the session. So I don't need to say much about it, I'm sure. We know that the structures are the foundation for biofouling. And over time, there is a community enriched there that actually increases the biomass of the benthic fauna by 4,000 on the pile structure. And 89% of that falls onto the star protection, so most of the biomass is actually down here. On the scale of a wind farm, this biomass would increase by 14, and these are all estimates that come from the report by Borgrums. But it's actually a lot of biomass. So what does that mean? Why do I tell you that now? Most of these are actually suspension feeders. So they interact with the phytoplankton in the water column, and so they kind of add to the effects I was just talking about. This is a very nice figure on this, but basically the main information is that this comes again from a simulation where they implemented this filter feeding process into their models, and there they found that actually their filter feeders could respond into a 10% reduction of primary production inside the wind farms. So that comes on top of what we had before. Finally, what does it mean for fishes? And also this, I don't think I need to say much about it, but actually here I included the study by Lena, which I actually like a lot because it really proves this is a very nice before-after control experiment, where you see that the amount of fish biomass, and mainly demersal fish, has increased substantially at different offshore wind sites after the construction. And recently, there has been a couple of studies. Nino Mavagi, for example, published some very nice analysis on stomach content analysis that actually showed that this is most likely due to this better prey availability or this better food availability. So these artificial structures create an attraction for fish in the area. But of course, not only artificial reefs effects travel up the food web, but also all the impacts that I talked to you before. So here we go back to our model system. I talked about this. We have the atmospheric model, the physical model, and we have a biogeochemistry model. In this case, however, that has been expanded by a fish group. So it's kind of fully coupled into the system. So the fish becomes part of our ecosystem. And now I, of course, did exactly the same simulations I did before because I wanted to see how that affects the fish biomass. So we have, again, the same scenario, and then we have the net prime production system response. And that is very nicely, you can see how that also can be seen in the fish biomass. So we need to expect that some of those things we see in terms of fish changes inside offshore wind farms might not necessarily be related to the artificial reef structure or to other things, but maybe because the structuring of our ecosystem has been changed. So let me summarize what I've been talking to you about before. So we have 3 different processes that need to be considered together to actually understand how the system is structured. We have the atmospheric waves, which acts on a very large scale. We have this drag effect, which acts more like on a wind farm scale, and then we have an artificial reef effect that acts relatively locally. So if we try to summarize this somehow, we have these three effects, but we also need to consider where the offshore wind farms are actually situated. So if offshore wind farms are situated in a permanently mixed area, until now, what I can see, the effect seems to be relatively small, directly on the structure, so in a near field. We see stronger impacts from tidal waves and areas where the tidal velocities are relatively strong, so the mixing makes a much more of an impact compared to the atmospheric wave. And in the seasonal stratified regions, we actually see that the offshore wind waves, so the reduction in the strengthening of the stratification has the strongest impact. For the artificial reef, they normally just work on the near field. And until yesterday, I thought, well, it's probably more or less acting similar ways no matter where you plant it. But then I talked to Jolene Boyce, and I recommend you to do the same. So she has a very nice poster, and also their analysis indicates that it might actually be site-specific, what the effect of artificial reefs are. On a regional scale, clearly there is a dominance of the atmospheric wake effects. And I think this is the most important take-home message for many of you, maybe, that whatever happens inside the offshore wind farms is one thing, but we have changes on a regional scale that reach far beyond the scale of the offshore wind farm, and it can reach, for example, into marine protected areas. So I wanted to finally go briefly through this concept, because the offshore wind farms are built into our system. And even though it looks that there is a lot of space, if you look at these marine spatial plans, maritime spatial plans, sorry, we realize there is really not much space. So Germany is set, and the North Sea is tiny, and there are a lot of uses, and there are marine protected areas, and there is shipping, and there is military, all kinds of stuff. And the offshore wind farms are built inside, there's a need to interact. And if you just analyze, for example, the simulation with respect to marine, sorry, my hand started to cramp. I don't know how to. So if you just analyze our simulation with respect to the marine protected areas in the Germany EZ, well, I use Germany EZ because that's where I'm living and people are interested in Germany EZ. But it will be similar in other areas. You see that there is a clear response, even though there's not a single offshore wind farm built inside this. And there is some marine protected areas which seem to show larger changes, like for example here over Dogger Bank. And I think these systematic changes need to be considered for monitoring and for what's happening in these areas. If I still have time, I might have. Yeah. So we were also interested, of course, in how it interacts with fishing closer. We did a couple of simulations, so I choose this specific example because I think it's a very nice example. So we expanded our model system by a fish model. This is Osmose, a multi-species individual-based model for the North Sea. And made the closure experiment to see, first of all, how the biomass changed, but also if there are interaction among the species. So here again, so as I said, it's a multi-species individual-based model, and it has includes 12 economically relevant species and 3 types of fishing fleets. And this is the scenario that Deborah set up. So she closed these red areas, which are areas where offshore wind farms are planned for fishing, and also redistributed. And so she made 2 experiments, one where she just closed it for fishing, so took out the fishing in that area, reduced the mortality of the fish basically, and then she made a second experiment where she closed these areas for fishing and redistributed the effort in the vicinity according to already available fishing activities. So major outcome is, of course, for fish biomasses in the first instance, it's a good thing, right? There's a reduction in fishing mortality, so the biomass increases. in the area. What is also very interesting here is that for some species, it's really very good, while other species seem to even decrease. And that indicates that this not only changes the biomass per se, but also changes the food web interaction between these species in terms of competition and in terms of intercommunity predation. What happened in the second experiment, where she reallocated the effort? Well, there the effects get a bit less, obviously, but still, for some of the species, there seems to be actually rather positive, very close to these areas for fishing. So now I wanted to come back to this questionnaire, but maybe it's quite good that I can ask you now, personally. Did anybody change his or her opinion on what are the food web components that are most impacted by offshore wind farms? No. Some might a bit. Maybe the bird people? Okay, it was never my intention to actually. But I think the main message is that even though birds and mammals are pretty to look at, and we know that they're affected by offshore wind parks and structures, there is a substantial impact on the plankton dynamics. And the plankton is the base of the food web. So whatever happens to the plankton will be seen in the rest of the food web, also in the birds and also in the mammals. And it's not only local inside the offshore wind farms, but it's everywhere in the region, especially if we build such large installations of offshore wind farms. Of course, I left out a lot of other processes, and until now, I might not know whether one of these is maybe the major driver, and we completely forgot about it. But as I said before, there are disturbances also of electromagnetic fields. There are the noise effects. So there's a lot of research still needed, unfortunately. I wish we would already know everything about this. And finally, the last question, did anyone change his or her opinion on this? No. I wouldn't have expected it, because honestly, the answer to that question is no, yes, or no, or something. It's extremely difficult, because even though we can see, observe, model all these changes related to offshore wind farm, we need to contextualize it. We don't even know if it's a good side or a bad thing, and how it relates to other changes, to inter-annual variations. So even though for some things we definitely know, I mean, noise effects on mammals, they can die of it. We also know lower oxygen is not well received by most of the species, but for the rest, this is a very important thing to find out and to, yeah, this is probably the major question that's also been asked to us researchers. So I will leave you with a couple of open questions. How do multiple effects interact? How do the effects solidify after several years? How can we classify this effect? Can we use this information to optimize our installations to minimize environmental risk? For example, by changing the density of the turbines. As an indication that larger turbines have a less strong atmospheric wake effect on the ocean, or maybe by choosing locations that are well mixed. And of course, finally, how do all this interact with all the other uses that are planned in our systems? And with that, I thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions, Ute? I bet we do. You were fastest. You're going to get a microphone.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. My question is, did you assess indirect harm that this building of wind farms will bring, especially to dry land? It was in calculations published in the journal The Economist. How much we must increase production of rare earth metals and copper and so on, balsa wood. We built all this stuff, and it was awful rise, but they also took more moderate calculations, so clearly will not build this much. But anyhow, in 15 years we must produce and dig out from Earth 10 times more only copper.
That's a very important point. Obviously, it's not my field of research, but what I can see is that there is a definite need to analyze the life cycle of these materials, and also when it comes to carbon footprint. I mean, clearly we kind of mitigating the carbon in the atmosphere, but also during production there is a carbon produced. So yeah, as I said, it's not my field of research, so maybe someone else is better in answering that, but I appreciate the comment, yes.
Thank you, Ute, for a very nice talk. Does this work? Yes? You showed very clearly the effect on the turbulence in the water. So, what about the fish larvae? What about the impact on their dispersal, and was that included into what you said about the impact on fisheries?
No, I mean, due to time constraints, but it's good that you bring that up because I forgot to mention it. Due to time constraints, I couldn't mention it. So there are a couple of studies who looked at it because some of the wind farms are actually built in spawning grounds for economical fish species. At least I've seen publications on this. But as far as I know, there is not yet a clear response how that would affect fish larvae. So we have a student currently working on that topic to see how this affects, well, fish larval transport and also survival in near field, but also the connectivity between spawning grounds and nursery grounds. But there is that's a research field that I think needs also more attention.
Hello, hello. Ute, here. Hi, hi. Thank you. Really good talk. I told you last time on the bus you'll be great. See, I told you. I'm interested. Thank you for all the food for thought and planting the seeds. I think a lot of the challenges are that we are trying to run before we can walk in some instances, because we're just trying to really understand what's going on, how systems are working on. The study you show from Naomi Greenwood, we also have a lot of other interactions in the North Sea from benthos to all the way, so it'd be interesting to talk to you about more in that detail. But one thing that brings to mind as we are thinking about all these interactions is reversing the process, the decommissioning. In your opinion, what are going to be the biggest challenges? Because it seems to me that today challenges on plankton is something that we haven't even really looked at the level of detail that is required. So if we are to remove some of these structures, what would your thoughts, in your opinion, would be the priorities? Thank you.
I find that really interesting, and of course discussing also with colleagues. So for now, my impression is that these wind parks somehow change inside the wind parks. The system changed from a more pelagic dominated to a somewhat benthic demersal dominated system. It's really hard to say whether this is a good change or bad change, or maybe it's just a change. And the problem is, unless we can answer that question, is that good or bad, the question to what would be better, leave it in as artificial reefs or take it out, it's hard to answer, right? Because of course we create a new environment where new structures, new communities evolve, and then if we take it out, we start from new, right? We just try something that has been there, so it needs to redevelop something, and we don't know what will develop there, right? Will that be what we anticipate? Will we recreate the system as it has been before? Maybe not, because the system is so dynamic, so strongly changing, and climate change, I think that will be a stressor that will follow us for the next decades, no matter what we want.
Over here, I have a question.
So I think the presentation was very realistic, and I really appreciated that. My question, I guess, is, did you look at, well, I have two, but I'll start with the easy one. Did you look at the composition changes in the planktonic communities as well? Like the size of the copepods, for example, or the predominant species, and the other one as the spill into or the feeding of the Baltic or the upper salinity level, because the other one, if that was looked at as well.
Actually, no, the models, I'm a model, I'm sorry. The model simulation don't allow for analyzing the species composition or size compositions. But I think it's a very interesting question. So I think that's something to follow up and see. Because, I mean, if the structure anyway changes somehow the system from a pelagic to a Baltic system, we might at least locally get changes in the community. On the other hand, I mean, in the North Sea, Baltic Sea might be different. Huh? But in the North Sea, it's very dynamic. You have strong currents and you have characteristic timescales of about 3 to 5 years. So which really means the North Sea is more or less set to zero after a couple of years. And every North Sea modeler would know that it's kind of, you don't need long spin-up times. You just start somewhere, wait a bit, and then you're there. So I'm not so sure it would actually change the overall composition of the species in the plankton. But it's definitely worth looking at. I mean, it's an interesting question. Baltic? You mean spillover from like North Sea into the Baltic? I don't think that the ecosystem changes will strongly spill over into the Baltic. Why? There is, of course, there is a water coming from the North Sea into the Baltic, but it's mainly deep water, right? So you have a general outflow from the Baltic that's just systematic outflow of surface water from the Baltic that goes along the Norwegian Trench. So I don't think that much biomass or ecosystem things would really kind of spill over into the Baltic, and then probably not that far, because normally North Sea species are not so very, they don't love this freshwater very much. So I wouldn't expect that, but of course.
Hi. I really appreciate all your information about the effects on plankton. I think that more focus has been done on fisheries and other stuff, so I really appreciate that. And maybe I'll ask you later how to advise to contact the government to, increase their interest in the zooplankton monitoring as well. But I had a question about your model. Was that informed, or is there a way to inform it with some observations? Because I know this is modeling, so it's more about predicting. But have they been any monitoring on plankton so you can kind of couple it or inform the model in a certain way?
Yes and no. For models in generally, yes. So I mean, there is, for example, these operational services. They all use monitoring and do data assimilation to basically constrain their models to observation. My model doesn't do this, but it could theoretically. For example, the same ecosystem model Cosmos used in the Arctic operational forecast, and there they use, for example, chlorophyll measurements from space to be assimilated in the system. So it's possible, and it's probably also in that context.
One last question up there.
Okay, thank you, Ute. Have you compared, at least in your mind, the magnitude of the effect you show, so the response of the ecosystem to this wind farm deployment, to the response that we might expect in the North Sea from the climate change? So, for instance, 50 years from now, does that remain significant in front of what we might expect from climate change?
Well, of course, we don't know exactly, but there are projections of changes in primary production. They also project something like a reduction in primary production by about 10%, most of them. So the amount of change might be the same, however, temporal and spatial scales are of course different. So the climate changes that happens on a rather long well, not in Earth system timescales, but in human timescales on a rather long timescale. Well, of course, these changes happen instantaneously, right? You build that thing and then something happens. On spatial scales, of course, we expect kind of a rather system-wide change from the climate change. And here the changes, of course, if you only build wind farms, well, it might also be system. I take that back. So we have system-wide changes from those, but the timescales are clearly different.
Thank you. That was a very important last question. And compliments also to your presentation. It's like this good book that you want to go back to it and read it once more. So hopefully that's something that we will be able to do, all of us. Thank you. Also on behalf of ICES, we'll like you to give this as a thank you.